Hello everyone, my name is Lori Quiller and welcome to the Air Force Culture and Language Center's Facebook Live event for Arts in German from West Virginia University, and was commissioned as second lieutenant in the Air Force as a distinguished graduate from ROTC. He completed his Master of Arts in German in 1970 and entered active duty as an intelligence officer. He is a graduate of Squadron Officer School, a distinguished graduate with a PhD in foreign language education from the Ohio State University, as well as Air Command and Staff College and Air War College. In 1987, he became Associate Tenure Professor and Department Head of the Department of Foreign Languages and at the United States Air Force Academy, and has stayed on staff until today, as well as a consultant to the organization he helped foster more than a decade ago, the Air Force Culture and Language Center. It's a tremendous honor to introduce Brigadier General Retired Gunther Mueller to the Air Force's Global Classroom. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Lori, and thank you for having me on the program. Before we get started, I'd like to thank the many LREC capable people out there doing the work of national defense today, and also thank those working behind the scenes like Mr. Howard Ward, Director of the Culture and Language Center here in Montgomery, and Mr. Russell Fraz, the Director of Air Force Force Development and the longest serving senior language authority we've ever had in the Air Force.
Thank you, sir. So, General Mueller, let's begin with the weeks and months following 9/11. Around this time, conversations in the Department of Defense started to turn toward building and sustaining international partnerships that could combat terrorist threats. How did these conversations lead to the creation of the Air Force Culture and Language Center?
That's a great question, and I actually like talking about these kinds of things, so thank you for that.
Thank you, sir.
The short answer to your question is, which is one of how did the Culture and Language Center evolve from what was probably a bullet on some high-level memo to the great organization that you have here today? And the short answer is that the 2005 Defense Language Transformation Roadmap directed all DoD agencies to improve culture and language skills across the workforce. And the Culture and Language Center here in Montgomery has been doing that and doing it well, as you know, for about 15 years. The tragedy of 9/11 and the Iraq and Afghanistan wars after that exposed some LREC deficiencies in the Department of Defense. Senior leaders in government and throughout industry, commerce, diplomacy all recognized that we needed a national response to this problem. We just do not have enough people in language and culture capabilities to do the work that we need to do. The real challenge, in my view, is creating an LREC-capable workforce from a society that is largely monolingual. We Americans simply do not put a high priority in foreign language learning. It varies across the country. Some areas are a little better than others, but by and large, it is not a high priority for American education.
Yes, sir.
For example, only 1 in 5 K through 12 students are enrolled in foreign language programs.
That seems low.
That is low. At the other end of the spectrum, in college enrollments, foreign language enrollments are declining over the years. That's not a good sign either. Few Americans claim language proficiency through school. Well, about 16% of our population, which again,
Very low.
is very low. So the bottom line is the LREC deficiencies are rooted in education, in our American education system, and we need to partner with the education leaders as much as possible. In 10 years before the transformation roadmap came on the scene, 2005, in 1995, the Air Force commissioned a study of officer language training programs, all aspects of officer language skills, who had them, what they were doing with them, how they got the skills, how the Air Force was using them, and so on and so forth. The conclusion of that study was there was no coherent system to train, manage, and track or employ these skills. Not a very good report. In fact, those deficiencies were also found in many of these reports here from the Defense Intelligence Agencies, from the General Accounting Office, from the Defense Language Institute, and so forth. So these problems have been around for a long time, and it will require continued efforts to address these problems so that we can do what the Department of Defense needs to do in terms of national defense.
It's interesting that there's so much evidence-based research out there that we started with and continue with today.
That is interesting. And again, because the problem is rooted in the education system, it's clear that once people come into the workforce, particularly in the government workforce, they're not going to be able to learn those skills as quickly and as deeply as they need to. This slide for me is a defining moment in that General Vasilio's comment recognizes that we need people with language skills and culture skills in place ready to go. So there's no time for long training periods. In fact, you may know that language training for Air Force people, language training is about the longest period of training that we have, up to 64 weeks at the Defense Language Institute.
Yes, sir.
That's a huge commitment of time and resources. So figuring out a way to do this a little bit better is a good thing for us to be doing. The Defense Language Institute, by the way, is an excellent institute, school, training program that has trained tens of thousands of people over the years, and I don't know how many languages and to what level. So they're doing a great job out there. And this quote is not in any way a condemnation of what they're doing. In fact, it recognizes that they do what they do well, but we just don't have the time to take people off the workforce, out of the workforce, to put into language training for as long as it takes. And it does take a long time to gain real proficiency. I like to talk in terms of usable skills, not necessarily the interagency roundtable scaling 1 through 5, but usable skills. That's what's important for us in the Air Force.
It also goes back to something that you said earlier about these are skills that can't just be in time trained.
That was one of the outcomes of this study, that in fact, because there isn't time to take people off the line, the just-in-time training has filled in where we have needed language skills, but that's not a vision of the future, because things are moving so fast, so rapidly, that it's very difficult to predict any of these needs more than a few months. Think of what's happening in the world today, for example. The unpredictable international security environment today speaks volumes of how we need more people to handle these skills.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Let me say a couple of comments about the practical implications of this Defense Language Transformation Roadmap. This was a huge document. It took several years to develop all of the thoughts and ideas that ended up being there, and it was the forcing function for a lot of the things that we do today, a lot of the things that you're doing here at the Culture and Language Center and around the world. This is the thing that said to us, hey, we need to do better at this. We have some deficiencies here. We know that there are some challenges, but we need to do better. And I think that many organizations around the Air Force particularly are actually doing much better than they have for many years. But we figured out how to talk about language even. In other words, we used to talk about seat time and courses and semesters and those kinds of things. Now we're focused more on capabilities. What can you do with the language that you learned? How is it employed in the Air Force and more broadly in national defense? We expanded the perspective of language in that including culture and regional affairs into the language discussions became very productive in terms of designing programs. And we had a broader understanding of language learning itself. There's no easy, fast, cheap solution to this. Let me repeat. There is no easy, fast, cheap solution. And yes, this is what our budget people, and in many cases our leaders, because they're faced with many competing requirements, this is not something they want to hear. But there are none. We've been looking for them for years. No easy, fast solutions. There you go. The roadmap also inspired improvement in learning tools and better software. And I think technology has helped to allow us to distribute these learning materials and to make them available, more readily accessible and readily available. In fact, your global classroom idea down here is excellent and right on, spot on, in terms of putting these materials out there for LREC interested airmen to learn more about these skills. Now, the bottom line here is that more is better. More of a lot of things is better, but more of this is certainly better. The problem is trying to figure out, because of competing requirements for resources, okay, both time and money, the problem is figuring out how much more, for whom, when the training ought to take place, and to what ends. These are difficult questions. And in my experience over the many years that I've been involved in this, a lot of people have been involved in trying to figure out answers, and we're still working on figuring out some of these answers.
Those are hard questions.
They are difficult questions, no question about it. Okay. In 2008, the then Senior Language Authority commissioned a group of people to figure out some of these, try to come up with answers for this so that we can align the capabilities and requirements for Air Force people so that we could see as much as possible predicting future needs based on missions, based on mission requirements and so forth. So this group worked really hard to develop what we called the Air Force LREC flight plan. And this flight plan was going to marry these requirements and capabilities so that we could answer some of these questions of for whom, to what ends, and so forth. One of the questions that we answered was, does every airman need language proficiency? And the answer was clearly no.
Okay.
Not every airman was judged to need proficiency in language capabilities. Familiarization with foreign language, an introduction to foreign language, all of those things, yes, which through our education system, although I said it doesn't necessarily prioritize foreign language, it does expose people to it, not to the point of what I consider to be usable skills.
Right.
But it's more an orientation and an introduction into the language business. The service responses to the language transformation roadmap varied widely. If you can, I remember back in those days, the pressure was on, the Congress was watching, the Congress was interested in our doing something. And not many years down the road, but now, the Congress wanted us to do things now. The Department of Defense leadership wanted us to do something now. They wanted us to fix the problem now. The problem has been around for a long time, and we did what we could and responded as we could, but it took time. If you consider, for example, that from the time the roadmap was published in 2005 until we started the LEAP program, Language Enabled Airman Program, was about 5 years. That's not long in terms of setting up a center and figuring out what you want to do and all those kinds of things, but it's a long time in terms of you're not doing it now. So,
but that was a lot of foundation building that you were working on.
There was a lot of foundation building. It was important to, I'll get to this in a minute, but it was important to figure out how much would be devoted to culture training versus language training. The culture training, in many ways, was a little bit easier in terms of having the materials and doing seminars and those kinds of things. It's not a proficiency-based kind of thing as language is. On the other hand, language was easier to deal with because we knew how to deal with it. We had the Interagency Language Roundtable, the ILR, scale from 1 through 5, and people sort of either knew about this or certainly understood the reason we have these kinds of measurement tools that in those days we did not have for culture programs and area studies programs, area expertise. So that's one of the reasons that language was sort of centric to the whole enterprise.
I've had some of the LEAP scholars that I've interviewed when I've asked them about studying culture and language together, and they said you can't study one without the other, that they are the bridge together. True.
They are definitely the bridge together. The interesting thing is that some people believe that enough language leads to cultural competence. And I'm not one of those. I don't believe that that's true. And as I'll mention in a few minutes here, Dr. Dan Hank, who was the first director of the Language and Culture Center down here, very persuasively argued that point, that culture, although culture and language are related, obviously, one does not lead to the other. And so we needed to kind of break that up and figure out, well, again, how much of this versus how much of that and so forth.
Well, actually, that leads us to our next question. In the early days of Desert Shield and Desert Storm, the focus was primarily on language, as you mentioned, but hoping that our airmen would pick up on those cultural cues on their own and that the knowledge would eventually come along on its own. So how did the study of culture come into that fact? You mentioned Dan Hank and his studies?
Dan Hank and some of his colleagues, anthropologists and behavioral scientists, clarified that for us. And as I said, I'll tell you, from a perspective of a language teacher, for example, we talk in language courses, we talk in terms of big C culture, which is history, politics, museum sort of kinds of things, literature, versus small C culture, which is the daily lives of people, school, families, friends, and so on and so forth. And even with the big culture, eventually it just does not lead to the cultural competence that Dr. Hank was talking about. It just doesn't happen. So while these people are well-versed in the culture of a country or a region, there needs to be some culture training to get to that level where, as he said, what we wanted to do was to provide airmen with the knowledge and skills to shape events for positive outcomes. Shape events. Now, I don't shape many events, so we can understand how difficult that is.
Yes, sir.
Certainly in a combat situation or an unfamiliar situation overseas, where our brilliant young airmen are put in places where they need to maneuver and navigate those things. So it's a very good question. The group that I talk about that was established in 2008 actually dealt with that quite extensively, because it's important, because it's, again, competition for resources is always there. And we can't say, okay, everybody in the Air Force is going to do this or that or the next thing. It just doesn't happen. So those discussions were very, very important. And Dr. Hank was instrumental in getting us to think about in terms of the culture being these skills to shape events. That was critical. And I think that continues today. So thanks to him for that great work back in the day, as they say. We mentioned the LEAP program a couple of times. I love talking about the LEAP program. Language Enabled Airman Program. Okay. On the screen, you'll see the LEAP mandates, which came from Congress down to the Chief of Staff and many others. These are just some examples. And the mandates are clear. Find the right people.
Right.
Maintain and use their skills. Create a bench of language-capable personnel for this surge idea. Increase in-house capability among warfighters. In other words, we can't rely on contractors to do this. It has to come from the warfighters themselves. And institutionalize a program to fix the problem. Well, we've been talking a little bit about the problem, and the problem is big, but there are ways, obviously, that we can do much better, and we're trying to do that. So out of this study group, this working group, to try and figure out how much to whom, when, and all those kinds of things, the LEAP program began to take shape in that, okay, what can we do? Not worry so much about what we can't do, but what can we do? And there were some things that became very obvious. We started thinking about, wait a minute, if we're not going to do the whole Air Force, if we're not going to provide language proficiency training for the whole Air Force, where should we start? Well, the answers were so obvious that after a while you said, duh. So we decided to start with what capabilities we had in the Air Force, people with language and culture skills, and moved from beyond that and said, okay, let's figure out who wants to do this and figure out if they have any history of capability in language proficiency. So there came the idea of willing and able. So of all of the Air Force people out there, we decided to look at those who are willing, in other words, volunteers, and those who are able, who have a history of performance, grades in school, grades in college, whatever, okay? So this willing and able idea began to take shape, and we said, now, The 2006 Quadrennial Defense Review, which is a high-level document that says, look, here's the future as we see it. One of the things that they said very clearly was that there was no time to provide officer language training other than the pre-commissioning programs. In other words, there's no time to take people out of the cockpit and put them into language training. Back to the idea of people need to be in place and ready to go from General Vasilio. So the academies, the service academies, the Air Force Academy included obviously, were given money directly from OSD to help expand the programs. What they did was they created a few more courses, they created higher requirements for language in the programs, and the opportunities for study abroad, both short-term study abroad kind of things like your programs here, the immersion programs, and longer periods of semester abroad and exchanges. So it expanded that possibility for those people, and that was a good thing. So now, getting back to the LEAP idea, we said, well, look what we have here. We have a whole bunch of ROTC and Air Force Academy graduates coming out into the Air Force, and we don't know who has what level of skills. We just don't know because, interestingly enough, records from the commissioning programs to the active duty Air Force just don't transfer. So there has to be another step in there. So we said, here we go. Why don't we gather up some people out of these commissioning programs after graduation, ask them if they want to continue language training, and give them the opportunity to do that. And bingo, there was LEAP. We're still doing it today.
You make it sound so easy.
It was so easy and so simple, and yet so hard to get to that point because it took us years. But that's in fact what we did. And we started with a pilot study. Mr. Jay Warwick here at the center at the time, and the Air Force, I was retired by then, but the Air Force Academy Department of Foreign Language got together and said, okay, here's what we can do. We've been doing these programs for many years. You can build on them, and we'll do a pilot study and kind of see where we get, how far we get. And as you well know, it's been a thriving, very popular program among our airmen out there. We didn't know at the time. We didn't know if you'd been a language major in college, if you wanted to continue doing that, or we just didn't know. And so the pilot study idea came on board, and we ran with it. And then every year it's been growing and it's growing. And now we're up to, gosh, I don't know, probably 1,200 to 1,500 applications a year, of which we take about 300 and put into the program. It's been a great program with great participation and cooperation.
And there's 2 LEAP boards a year, one in the spring and one in the fall.
Exactly. The one in the spring is for newly commissioned officers out of ROTC and the Air Force Academy. So they have not been in the Air Force. And it's another obvious thing. When these lieutenants graduate, there's often a waiting for training period during which they do nothing. Nothing.
Nothing?
Almost nothing.
Almost nothing.
We find them jobs to do, but they're not critical jobs, certainly. We find them jobs to do. But that was another sort of eye-opener, saying, gosh, why don't we think about putting these people into language training while they're waiting for other things to do? Pilot training sometimes can be, the gap in time can be as much as 6 or 7 months in some cases, because obviously they can't get everybody into those training cockpits at the same time. So here was another piece of the puzzle that kind of fit in, and we said, this may be worth looking at. And we've been doing that without interrupting anything with the pilot training. In other words, the bases the lieutenants are selected to go to and the timing and so forth, we did not want to mess with any of that and just fill in, as I said, gaps wherever they might show up.
Yes, sir.
So here we are. We've got LEAP, and the foundation foundational pillars, as I mentioned, the willing and able, and the general purpose forces. In other words, these are not for professionals. There's a little bit of crossover between FAO and officer language
Yes,
training, but it's not. It's designed for the general purpose force. Quality candidates, and the idea of shared responsibilities is also very powerful in that the Air Force provides resources and time, and the airman provides time and commitment and dedication.
Dedication being key.
Dedication being key, and motivation being key.
Absolutely.
Because motivation, as you well know, is the bedrock of any kind of training or education program. So that was important. And the idea that these skills need to be developed over time. And just like anything else, language and culture training takes time. And if we start with high school programs, college programs, commissioning programs, and then build on those, we've got a pretty solid foundation.
Yes, sir.
And so when we select a mid-grade or senior officer for whatever training or whatever requirements are out there, the solid, robust skills built over long periods of time will outweigh this just-in-time training idea. I think in terms of a kind of an immunization, you know, you're going to country X,
Yes, sir.
boom, here's your set of skills. It just doesn't work that way. If need be, we have to do that, but that's not the ideal way. And then the other part of this program was tracking their progress and accountability for what they're doing. Your folks down here in the leader database have done a remarkable job in tracking these LEAP participants over now, gosh, over 10 years.
Yes, sir.
And it's the only system that I know of in the Air Force or elsewhere where we have this longitudinal data on what people are doing, how they're progressing in their skills, how they're doing on the tests, and all those kinds of things. And I think I'm just amazed at what your folks down here in the language division have been able to do with those LEAP participants. So
It is a powerful snapshot of a LEAP scholar's career in that database.
it has been, and to validate the LEAP experience, we look.
I believe the last time they had the foreign area officer board,
Yes.
72 or 73% were
Yes.
actually LEAP scholars.
It's been wonderful, and like I said, this is the kind of thing that makes people take notice because
sir.
it's important. First of all, the skills are better, okay, because of this long incubation period, if you will, of exposure to language and culture, and they're ready to go. They can move right into the other FAO training program. So that's been a wonderful thing, and it has grown every year. It started out, as I recall, the first couple of years in the 20%, then it moved into the 40s, and now you're right in that it's about 72% of the people were out of the LEAP group. So, what have we not talked about here? We talked about Dr. Hank.
I'd like to talk a little bit, if I could, about, since we have the LREC symposium here this week, I'd like to get your impressions about what the language, regional expertise, and culture education, or what we call LREC, brings to our armed forces. And that's a broad topic, but
It's a broad topic.
It is.
It's an excellent question, and it's implied in there that everything we do needs to connect to operations, Air Force operations, and certainly in the international security arrangement as well. So I think those kinds of questions are best answered by some of our senior leadership. For example, and I quote, LREC skills are enduring warfighting competencies critical to global mission readiness and integral to joint operations. What else can I say?
Well, that just answered my next question about how critical is it?
It's critical. It's very critical. LREC skills are essential to mission readiness in today's dynamic global environment. This comes from the Department of Defense Strategic Plan. And again, we get to this General Vasilio notion of in place, ready to go.
Yes, sir.
No time to take people from maintenance responsibilities or flying responsibilities or anything that they're involved in. Pull them off that and put them into language training. Just nowhere to do that.
As our military leaders begin to see LREC education as being even more critical going on, moving on in the future, do you think that there will be more conferences like the LREC Symposium? Or the need for more conferences like the LREC Symposium?
The need for greater cooperation and collaboration will always be there, and I do think it's growing because things are complicated out there in the world today,
yes, sir.
Obviously. And the unpredictability of how things are moving in the defense business is just, it's mind-boggling in some cases. So yes, I think in order for us to stay together and work together on these things, it is important that we continue having these kinds of conferences and collaborative projects on materials development, on methods, on employing some of the new technology, AI, AR, for example. They're doing some things at the Air Force Academy on AR where you put this thing on your head and you're swimming around somewhere doing whatever. I don't know, I haven't done it yet, but those kinds of things, practical, hands-on kinds of training is invaluable in our business. Absolutely.
That's true. That's true. Well, it's definitely not going to be going away in the future. It'll be growing, I think, in the future.
I think you're absolutely right. Here, LREC in operations, this also answers your question far better than I could. So if we look at this, the first line, everyone should learn basic language skills, period. Everyone. This comes from General McChrystal, who was the commander of all forces in Afghanistan. This comes from 2009. More importantly, he spells out in here, each unit should have at least one leader that speaks Dari and at least the 0+ level with a goal of 1. In other words, here's a real metric, okay? Do you have that person who speaks Dari or Pashto? No. Well, then you haven't met the requirement. Are you moving from 0+ to 1? No. Then we need to work on ways to do that. And here's the critical part. This language skill is as important as your other basic combat skills. So in other words, we're moving beyond it's nice to have language and culture skills to it's critical. And it's important. It's just as important as your other combat skills. This was a phenomenal statement from General McChrystal at that time. Oops. This comment comes from a Philippine general, brigadier general, and I think it was this month or last month, where some of our LEAP participants were involved in connecting Filipino Marines with American Marines to conduct this exercise.
Yes, sir.
And as the general said, the important thing here is the ability to build trust. Now, in partnership building, trust, I would think, is invaluable because otherwise you're just going through the motions.
Yes, sir.
And this, in a training environment, this is absolutely critical. Okay. The critical, let me read a couple more quotes. Today's operating environment demands a much greater degree of language and regional expertise, requiring years, not weeks, of training and education. Years. Okay, this gets us back to the idea of, excuse me, there are no easy, cheap solutions to this. When you're talking about years of training, you're talking about lots of commitment and lots of resources. And so, excuse me, this is true. It's absolutely true that in order for us to produce the kind of foreign area officer, for example, it will require years of training. General Mattis once said that, quote, having someone who can speak Arabic is like having another infantry battalion. That's
wow.
That's a powerful comment.
Yes, sir.
Okay, and it's General Schwarzkopf during the first Gulf War said that that language and culture people were force multipliers, so that whatever organization, whatever they were doing, they were able to do it much better. Your next question?
My next question. We did cover about LREC education, where it's going in the future. So unless you had anything else that you wanted to say about that, before we close, sir, I was wondering if you had anything else that you wanted to say, any final thoughts?
Are we ready to close?
We're getting there.
Okay. Getting back to the idea of where do we see this going in the future? Another quote from the Secretary of Defense is, "Our vision is a world in which the U.S. is a stronger global leader through proficiency in foreign languages and understanding of cultures of the world." Doesn't get much clearer than that. Do you think?
I don't think so.
So
it's another powerful.
The need
quote.
For what we're doing here will continue to grow.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're seeing right now the importance of interdependence in Europe and Eastern Europe and in the Pacific. I mean, it's just a fact of life, really. So there's no question that this will continue. Our airmen are called upon to build partnerships in complex international settings. Mm-hmm. This places an ever-growing impetus on the development and maintenance of LREC skills. And our final quote, LREC skills are not just for multipliers, they are critical to successful engagement with partners and lead to a deeper understanding of known and potential enemies. Right skills, right time, right place.
That's a good one too. And I think you have some slides
I have some slides
of our LEAP scholars
showing LEAP scholars in action. This is what it's all about. This is why they do what they do, so that they can go out there and help the Air Force or other services do what they do. Partnering in Europe to help the refugee operations and other intel support.
Our LEAP scholars have worked with us on what we call training partnership requests, and they have been worldwide on some of these requests, and the stories that we get back are just phenomenal.
They're remarkable, and sometimes it's just one LEAP scholar, sometimes it's a team, and they go in there, and what's obvious, as you know from the reports that they write, the energy and enthusiasm.
Oh yes.
These folks take to those missions is incredible. I mean, they are dying to use those skills in an operational setting.
Yes, sir.
Without exception. Here's some more examples. The Afghan reception and bed down.
Mm-hmm. This was one working with the LEAP scholars for Operations Allies Refuge and Welcome. They just came from all over and scattered to the different bases. They used our app. We told them how, what to do is go to the Afghanistan section of the app, and the stories that we got back were just amazing.
Yeah, it is remarkable.
And that was a quick one too. That was one where it could not be just in time trained. Yes, sir.
Almost overnight.
Mm-hmm. No.
This is a shot from the Latin American Air Chiefs Conference that happens every year, and this LEAP scholar here taking advantage of being next to the Chief of Staff for a
yes, sir.
selfie.
This is one of our famous stories of Lorraine Kelty. When she started her briefing, they took their earpieces out and started listening to her instead of their translators.
Yes.
And Captain Pagullo, this is another good one. She's a Tagalog speaker and conducted a tactical combat casualty care webinar and training session to 70 different nurses in Tagalog.
What this points out is the range of Air Force operations, both flying operations and all kinds of other things that these LEAP participants have been able to help with.
Mm-hmm. Now, this is a story that came out of Vermont National Guard, which was pretty interesting because we found out about it and we thought, the Vermont National Guard? But they were also speaking with, I think it was the Senegalese group. Yes, sir.
Yes.
And it's definitely total force.
Absolutely.
And as you mentioned earlier, with working with other branches, working with the Marines here. And we had mentioned that we do have an app. It's our AFCLC's culture app. So if you are here for the symposium, please download our AFCLC Culture Guide app and get the latest information on the schedule, the presenter information, location for the lectures, and this week's symposium, plus a different information about where to eat and the information on where to park and the Equal Justice Initiative. So, sir, do you have any final thoughts before we close?
I'm looking forward to participating in the 7th annual LREC conference. Hopefully see some of my old friends and make some new friends. So I look forward to that over the next week.
We have almost 500 people registered, so you'll have a lot of friends to be rubbing elbows with.
I don't have that many. Finally, can we wrap this up
Yes,
now?
sir. Yes, sir.
Finally, it's gratifying to me to have watched the Culture and Language Center evolve from, like I said, a line on somebody's briefing bullet to a productive, vibrant organization producing LREC skilled airmen and guardians to help support national and international security. Folks down here are doing a remarkably good job, and I wish you luck as you continue forward. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you, sir.
And I look forward to seeing everybody in the next couple of days.
Thank you so much, sir. And thank you so much for joining us today. And special thanks to our hosts this month, Mr. Les Fineff and his staff here at AUTV and AUPA. I'd also like to thank my outreach partner, Ms. Michaela McCurry, and especially those of you who've joined us for this episode of the Air Force's Global Classroom. And remember, we are AFCLC.